She hid that she'd escaped from an asylum. The sheriff read her papers and burned them. The envelope came on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesday was when Harlan Purcell swept out the jail, and I always made myself scarce while he did it, on account of Harlan's broom work raising more dust than it moved. I was standing on the porch with my coffee going cold in my hand when the rider came in from the east, and he didn't slow until he was right up to the steps. And he leaned down and held out a sealed packet tied in brown cord, and he said, "Sheriff Elias Cade." And I said, "That's me," and he said, "From the office of Dr. Amos Whitfield, Tucson, and be so kind as to sign the receipt," and I did. I turned the packet over a few times, my name on it in a hand too precise for anything good. Return address embossed, the word urgent written in the top corner and underlined twice. I set my coffee on the rail, and I went inside, and I put the packet in the left-hand drawer of my desk, and I locked it. I didn't open it for 3 days. That's not as strange as it sounds. In 15 years as the law in Harrow Creek, I'd learned that the things that arrive urgent are rarely urgent for the same reasons the sender thinks. Somebody else's emergency almost never carries the same weight once it hits your desk. You let it sit. You keep your eyes open. You see what shakes loose on its own. What had shaken loose, 11 days before that envelope arrived, was a woman. She'd come in on foot, which alone was enough to make you look twice, because nobody comes into Harrow Creek on foot from the east. East is 40 miles of alkali flat and scrub, and in March the wind off that flat can skin you. She'd come in around noon, coat wrong for the weather, no bag, no hat, walking like someone who decided not to stop walking until her body quit. Berta Hollins at the Mercantile saw her first and brought her water, and she drank it without saying a word, and when Berta asked her name she said Clara. Just Clara. Berta put her in the back room with a blanket. By the time I heard about it and came around, the woman was asleep sitting up against the wall with the blanket pulled to her chin. I stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was maybe 35. Dark hair come loose from a braid. One side of her face had a bruise gone yellow at the edges, which meant it was old, 4 or 5 days at least. Her hands were in her lap and her knuckles were scraped. She opened her eyes and looked straight at me. Most people, they see the star, they either sit up straighter or they look away. She did neither. She just looked at me, steady and measuring like she was deciding something. I said, "You need a doctor." She said, "I need to not be where I was." I said, "Fair enough. Bert'll feed you when you wake up." I went back to the office. Now I need to tell you something about Harrow Creek so you understand what came next. It's not a hard town. It's not Tombstone, not Dodge, not one of those places that had to be broken. It's a working town, cattle, a little silver in the hills, 2 good wells. People here mostly mind their own, but they notice. They watch. And a strange woman coming in alone from the East Flat with old bruises and no name beyond Clara, that was going to get around. And when it got around, opinions were going to form, and some of those opinions were going to find their way to me in the form of suggestions about what I ought to do about it. The first one came from Walt Gruber, who ran the bank and fancied himself a civic conscience. He came by that same afternoon, took off his hat, and held it in both hands the way he did when he was about to tell me something he thought I needed to hear. He said, "You know, there's a woman over at Berta's." I said, "I know." He said, "You know, she's got nobody with her and no account of herself." I said, "I know that too." He looked at his hat for a moment. He said, "People are wondering." I said, "Let them." He put his hat back on and left. He didn't look satisfied, but then Walt Gruber never looked satisfied. It was just how his face was made. Over the next 3 days, I saw her twice. First time she was eating at the table in the back of Berta's kitchen, and she looked up when I came through, and I said, "Just checking in," and she nodded and kept eating. Second time she was out back of the Mercantile in the cold morning air, standing still with her face tipped up toward the sky with her eyes closed, like she was feeling what it felt like to stand outside and not have anyone pull her back in. I didn't say anything that time. I turned and went back the other way. On the 3rd day, she came to the jail. She knocked on the open door, and I looked up from my desk, and she said, "You're the sheriff." I said, "I am." She said, "I want to know what you're going to do about me." I said, "Sit down." She sat. She had a steadiness about her now that she hadn't had when she first came in, though the caution in her eyes hadn't moved. She was wearing a dress that Berta had found for her somewhere, dark blue wool, a little long at the hem. Her braid was pinned. The bruise was mostly gone. I said, I'm not going to do anything about you unless there's a reason to. She said, there's going to be a reason. There are people looking for me. I said, what kind of people? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the kind with papers. I looked at her, she looked back at me. Neither of us looked away. I said, what kind of papers? She said, the kind that say I'm not right in my mind, and I need to be kept. I said, are you? She said, not right in my mind. I said, yes. She said, I'm sitting here talking to you, aren't I? I said, that doesn't answer it. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles were healed now, mostly. She said, my husband had me committed. A year and a half ago. The place was in Tucson. I escaped 3 weeks ago, and I've been walking and riding in whatever direction got me furthest away, and now I'm here. I said, why'd he have you committed? She said, because I wouldn't stay quiet when he wanted me quiet, and because it was cheaper than a divorce. The room was still for a while after that. Outside, someone drove a wagon past, and the wheels squealed and someone yelled at a horse. I said, you got anybody? She said, a sister in Colorado, Pueblo, I was trying to get there. I said, that's a ways. She said, I know. I said, you can stay at Berta's as long as you need. Berta's not going to put you out. She looked at me a beat, like she was checking whether the offer was more than it seemed. I let her look. Then she stood up and said, thank you, and left. I sat with that for a long time after. Not with the story exactly, with the way she'd told it. No performance in it, no play for sympathy. She'd said the facts the way you'd report a stretch of bad road. Here's what it was, here's what I did about it, here's where I am now. It was the plainest telling I'd heard in years, the plainest and the hardest. I didn't open the drawer that day either, but I thought about it. The letter that changed things didn't come from Tucson. It came from Harrow Creek's own postmaster, a man named Gerald Inch, who had the misfortune of being the most literal person I'd ever met. Gerald processed mail. That was Gerald's world. A sealed piece of mail went to the person whose name was on it, and that was the beginning and the end of Gerald's theology. But Gerald also had a conscience, which was his problem. He came in on a Thursday morning looking like he hadn't slept. He sat down across from me and said, I need to tell you something, but I don't want to have told you. I said, those two things don't fit together very well. He said, I know that. He put a piece of paper on my desk. It wasn't addressed to me. It was a letter that had come through Gerald's office addressed to Marshal Dan Creedover in Willow Flats, which was the next town east, and it was from a detective agency, and it was open. I looked at Gerald. He said it was open when I got it. I said, Gerald. He said it was. I picked it up and read it. The letter said that a woman named Clara Frances Aldis, née Bowen, had escaped from the Whitfield Sanitarium in Tucson on the 22nd of February, and that her husband, a Mr. Theodore Aldis of Tucson, had engaged the Morrow Detective Agency to locate and return her to the facility, and that based on information received they had reason to believe she might be in or around Harrow Creek or Willow Flats, and could the marshal please advise and cooperate in her apprehension. And they'd be grateful for any assistance. I read it twice. I set it on the desk. I said to Gerald, was there anything else in that envelope? He said there was a note from Marshal Creed saying he'd passed this along because if she was anywhere near Harrow Creek that was my jurisdiction, and also that he didn't much like the sound of it himself, but the law was the law. I said, and where's that note now? Gerald said, I lost it on the way over. I looked at him, he held my gaze. I said, you can go, Gerald. He stood up, put his hat on, and went. I sat there for a while. Then I unlocked the left-hand drawer. The packet from Tucson had 5 documents in it. A writ signed by a Judge Harlan Foy ordering the return of one Clara Frances Aldis to the custody of the Whitfield Sanitarium. A signed statement from a Dr. Amos Whitfield certifying that the patient was suffering from persistent nervous disorder, erratic conduct, and delusions of persecution, and was a danger to herself and others. A letter from Theodore Aldis, which was the thing I read most carefully, and which was also the thing I set down most carefully when I was done. And 2 more pages of what they called clinical notations, which were the saddest thing I'd read in some time, being a list of a woman's behaviors and words and silences translated into evidence of madness by a man who'd been paid to translate them that way. I read everything. Then I rebuilt the fire in the stove because it had burned down, and I put every piece of that correspondence into it, one at a time. The writ. The doctor's statement, the letter from Theodore Aldous, which I watched until it was gone completely. The clinical notations, the envelope, the brown cord. I watched the last of it turn to ash. Then I went to find her. She was at Berta's, sitting at the long table in the kitchen, mending a tear in a sleeve with a needle and black thread. And when I came in, she looked up and read my face the way people do when they've spent enough time watching for bad news. She went very still. I said, "Sit tight a minute." I sat down across from her. I said, "There was a packet came for me from Tucson." She set the mending on the table. Her hands were flat on the cloth. I said, "I read it." She didn't say anything. I said, "I burned it." The stillness in her face shifted. She looked at me with something behind her eyes that she wasn't letting out yet, like she didn't believe it and wasn't going to let herself believe it until she was sure. I said, "There's also a letter from a detective agency that came to the marshal in Willow Flats. That marshal passed it along to me, which means it's mine to handle. I'm going to write back to the Morrow agency and tell them I had no information regarding their subject and consider the matter closed. You're going to need to get moving, not tonight but soon, within the week." She said, "Where?" I said, "You said your sister is in Pueblo." She said, "Yes." I said, "There's a stage that runs north out of here, connects to the rail up at Sutter's Mill. I can put you on it. I can give you enough to buy the ticket and a few days' meals, and a room on the other end until your sister gets to you." She said, "Why?" I said, "Why what?" She said, "Why are you doing this?" I looked at the table. I said, "Because I read those papers and I read what was in them, and what was in them was a husband who wanted his wife kept somewhere that made his life easier, and a doctor he'd paid to write it up official, and a legal system that signed off on it because that's the kind of thing legal systems do when you bring them the right piece of paper. And I'm not going to be the instrument of that." I looked up at her. She was looking at me with something open in her face that she usually didn't let out. The caution still there, but behind it something else. She said, "You could lose your star." I said, "I've had my star 15 years. I know what it's for." She looked down at her hands again. The needle was still stuck in the sleeve. After a moment she said, "I don't have a way to repay you." I said, "I'm not asking for that." She said, "I know, that's what I mean." That was a Wednesday. I spent Thursday getting things arranged quietly. I sent a letter to Marshal Creed that said I'd looked into the matter and found nothing, which was the truth, the way I meant it. I spoke to Berta in private, who already knew more than I'd told her and who nodded once and didn't ask me anything about it. I got the stage schedule from the man who ran the relay, a Swede named Oberg who was the most incurious man I'd ever met, and who told me the price of a through ticket to Sutter's Mill without looking up from his ledger. Thursday evening I went back to Berta's and laid out the whole plan for Clara at the kitchen table. The stage left Friday mid-morning. Oberg's relay to Sutter's Mill, and from there the Colorado and Santa Fe ran twice weekly north. She could be in Pueblo inside of 5 days. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "And nobody knows." I said, "Berta knows. Gerald Inch knows as much as a man can know from a letter he never received. Oberg doesn't know anything and wouldn't care if he did." She nodded slowly. I said there might be a follow-up from the agency. "If there is, I'll handle it." She said, "What if they come here in person?" I said, "Then they'll talk to me, and I'll tell them what I told them in the letter." She looked at me a long moment. She said, "And if they don't believe you?" I said, "That's my problem to have, not yours." She looked down at the table. She picked up the mended sleeve and looked at the stitching. She set it down. She said, "My husband told me I was irrational. He said I couldn't see things clearly. He said I didn't understand what was good for me." She looked up. She said, "I want you to know that I see you clearly." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have made it smaller than it was. I just held her gaze and nodded. That's the moment I keep coming back to. Not the burning of the papers, which was its own thing. That moment at the table, the mended sleeve, the way she said it. "I want you to know that I see you clearly." 15 years I'd done this work. Done it quiet, done it mostly alone, done it the way it was supposed to be done because that's what the work required. You don't do it for the thanks. You do it because somebody has to and you're the one who said they would. But there it is, having someone see you, Really see. Not the star, not the reputation, not the story people tell when they talk about you. The actual you and what you're actually doing. The stage left at 10 in the morning. I was at the relay by 9:30. Oberg had the team ready. 2 other passengers were going north, a cattle buyer from Phoenix and a minister's wife visiting family, and they paid their bags no mind and climbed in, and that was that. Clara came with Berta. They walked from the mercantile together. I don't know what they'd talked about in their days together, and it wasn't my business to know, but the way they walked, Berta's hand on Clara's arm, told me something had passed between them that was more than lodger and landlady. Clara had a bag now, Berta's doing, I expect, dark blue coat better than what she'd come in wearing. She looked different than the woman who'd walked in from the flat 3 weeks before, held herself different, not taller exactly, steadier, like she'd found her feet again under her. She stopped in front of me. I gave her the envelope with the money and the ticket. She took it. She said, I wrote down my sister's address in Pueblo, if you need to contact me for any reason. I said, I appreciate that. She said, and if nobody comes looking, maybe someday you could just write, if you wanted. I said I might do that. She looked at me then the way she'd looked at me in the jail the first time, measuring, deciding, except whatever she was deciding this time had a different conclusion. She reached out and put her hand against the front of my coat, just flat against my chest, just for a moment, the way you'd touch something you wanted to remember the shape of. Then she took her hand back. She said, you're a good man, Elias Cade. That's a rarer thing than it ought to be. I said, you take care of yourself out there. She nodded once, turned and climbed up into the stage. Berta came to stand beside me while Oberg finished strapping the bags. Berta said quietly, you did right. I said, I know. She said, and it cost you something. I thought about that. I said some things ought to cost something. Oberg climbed up and snapped the reins, and the stage pulled out, swinging wide around the south end of the relay yard, and I watched it go until it was small against the flat, until it was a moving speck, until it was gone. The agency wrote back in April, a curt letter, professionally worded, expressing that they would like to speak with me in person regarding the matter of Clara Frances Aldis, and they planned to send a man to Harrow Creek the following month. I wrote back and told them to send whoever they liked. My answer would be the same as my letter. They sent a man named Osborne. He arrived on a Tuesday, which is funny. Tuesdays always seem to be the days things arrived. Osborne was compact and pale, and he wore good boots that were wrong for the country. He asked his questions with the professionally neutral face of a man accustomed to people who'd rather not talk to him, and I gave him the same neutral face back and told him what I'd told them in writing. No information. No record. Closed. He looked around my office. He said, you mind if I ask around town? I said, this is a free country. He spent 2 days in Harrow Creek. He spoke to Walt Gruber, who had nothing useful because Walt didn't know anything beyond what Walt always knew, which was what was right and proper and what the law required. He spoke to Gerald Inch, who had never received a letter about any such person and had no idea what the man was talking about. He spoke to Berta, who had housed a woman named Clara for a few weeks, a quiet woman with no last name given, who had moved on to wherever she was going, which Berta didn't know. On the 3rd day, Osborne came back to me. He said, I can't find what I came here to find. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. He looked at me for a moment. He said, you know what I think. I said, I expect you'll tell me. He said, I think you know more than you're saying. I said, that's your opinion to have. He said, a man in your position with a star. I said, a man in my position took an oath. To this county and its people and the law as it ought to operate. And the law as it ought to operate doesn't mean the law as it's sometimes used. There's a difference between those two things, and I know which one I'm here for. Osborne looked at me for a long moment. He put on his hat. He said, you're going to have trouble over this someday. I said, I've had trouble before. He left that afternoon. As far as I know, the agency never came back. There are things I still think about. Whether I did right in the strict formal sense, I know the answer I'd give to anyone who asked, and I know the answer I give to myself when I'm honest, and they're the same answer, which is that I slept fine from that night on. Whether she got to Pueblo, whether her sister was there, whether she found a life that let her breathe. I hope so. I think so. There are people who find their feet and don't lose them again, and she was that kind of person. I wrote the letter. In June of that year, I didn't know what I'd say when I sat down to write it, so I said what was true, that Harrow Creek was the same, that Osborne had come and gone, that she was clear. I said I'd thought about what she said to me at Berta's kitchen table, the part about seeing me clearly. I said that meant something to me, and I'd wanted her to know. She wrote back from Pueblo, 4 pages, her handwriting angular and neat. She wrote about the town, about her sister, about a school where she'd started helping the teacher, about the spring coming in over the mountains. Near the end she wrote, "I've thought a lot about what you said, that some things ought to cost you something. I think you're right. I think it's one of the best things I've ever heard anyone say." She signed it Clara Aldis, which was a different thing than just Clara. She was using her own name again. I read that letter a few times. Then I folded it and put it in the left-hand drawer, the same drawer where I'd locked the packet from Tucson. That drawer held different weight now. I wrote back. She wrote back. By the time the summer was over, we were writing every 2 weeks or so. And by fall, the letters had got to the kind of letters that are harder to write, not because you don't know what to say, but because you know too well what you want to say, and you're not entirely sure of your right to say it yet. In October, she wrote, "I've been thinking about a thing, and I want to say it outright because I find I'm not much interested in saying things around the edges anymore. I wonder if you might like to come up to Pueblo sometime, or if you can't do that, whether I might come down to Harrow Creek. I'd like to see the place that made you." I sat with that for 2 days. Then I wrote back and said I could come in November if that suited. That I had 3 weeks leave owing and hadn't taken it in 4 years. That I'd like to see Pueblo. She wrote back in 4 days, which was faster than the mail usually managed, and she said November suited her fine. I went to Pueblo the 2nd week of November. Her sister's house was on a street called Canby, a 2-story frame house with a porch, and I knocked on the door not quite sure what I was walking into, and Clara opened it. We looked at each other. There are moments you remember not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing does, because the ordinary shape of a thing is so exactly right that you just want to hold still inside it. She was herself, that was all. The same steadiness. The same measuring look, except it settled into something easy once she'd looked long enough. She said, "You made it." I said I did. She opened the door and I came in. I stayed 11 days. Her sister Ruth was a sensible woman with 2 kids and an easy way about her who didn't ask me too many questions about my intentions and seemed to form opinions slowly and hold them firmly once formed. By the end of the 1st week, Ruth looked at me the way people look at someone they've decided is all right, and that was good enough for me. Most of what those days were I'm not going to try and lay out here because they were ordinary in the best possible way. Long dinners, cold walks. Clara showing me Pueblo the way she'd come to know it, the school, the market, the river when the weather let us get near it. We talked about all kinds of things. We talked about the kind of things 2 people talk about when they're working out whether they fit. And we did fit. Not seamlessly, not without the places where things scraped a little, but fit the way things fit when they're real and not arranged. On the 9th day it snowed. We were on the porch with coffee watching it come down, and she said, without looking at me, "I've been thinking about Colorado winters." I said, "What about them?" She said, "They're long." I said, "I've heard that." She said, "I think I'd want someone to spend them with." I set my coffee down on the porch rail. The snow was coming soft, and even the way it does when the air is still. I turned and looked at her. She turned and looked at me. I said, "I think I could be that person." She looked at me for a long time in that way she had, the measuring gone from it, just looking. She said, "I think you could be too." It wasn't a dramatic thing. It didn't need to be. She put her hand around my arm, both her hands, holding on like you hold on when you've decided to stop going it alone, and we stood there watching the snow. I went back to Harrow Creek at the end of those 11 days. Back to the jail, back to Harlan Purcell's broom, back to Walt Gruber's opinions and Berta's kitchen and the left-hand drawer with her letters in it. I also went back to writing the letter that would need to be written, the one to the county commissioners about my intention to resign the Star at the end of the term, which was the following spring. It was a quieter thing to write than I'd expected. The Star had been a weight I'd chosen and carried, and it had meant everything it was supposed to mean, and that was exactly why I could put it down without regret. Some things you do until you've done them right. You don't have to do them forever. Clara moved down to Harrow Creek in the spring. Berta had a small house behind the mercantile that she'd been meaning to rent for years, and we took it. Ruth came down for the wedding in April with the kids and stayed a week, and Gerald Inch married us because Gerald was also the justice of the peace, a combination of offices that I'd always thought was a little mismatched, but which served its purpose just fine. I was 56 years old. I'd spent 30 of those years in one form of service or another, doing the thing that needed doing and mostly doing it alone and not minding that about it, because the work was enough and the work was right, and that was sufficient. But there is a different thing, and I know this now in a way I didn't know it before. There is a different thing about coming home to someone who knows exactly what you did and what it cost and doesn't call it anything grand, just sees it for what it was and sees you for what you are and stays. She keeps a kitchen the way she keeps everything, practical, nothing wasted, things where they ought to be. In the morning, she has the coffee on before I'm up, which I've told her she doesn't need to do and which she continues to do. After supper most nights she reads or sews and I read or I don't, and the room is easy and it's quiet the way rooms get when two people have gotten used to each other's silence. There's a letter in that left-hand drawer still. The first one she wrote me from Pueblo, the 4-page one, Some Things You Keep. It's a Tuesday morning now, cold still, though the snow's been gone a month. I can hear her in the kitchen from where I'm sitting, the sound of the stove, the sound of a cup set down on wood. A man spends enough years carrying things alone, and he forgets that it's heavy. You only know it was heavy once you set it down.